Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for chapter 28, section 1. And we're going to get into talking a little bit about the beginnings of World War II, as far as the war beginning. And so we're going to talk first of all about Axis aggression. But before we do this, somewhere in your packet, I want you to write down kind of our players here, the World War II alliances. A lot of times we look at this as our good guys versus bad guys. And so our allies, hence the good guys, were made up of Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and eventually the United States. When we talk about Great Britain, this would include all their dominions, all their colonies. So you can include places like Canada, India, Kenya, Egypt, all into that. Okay, when we talk about France, at some point in time, the French are going to be occupied by the Germans. And eventually we kind of refer to France in two different ways. We talk about Free France, which was kind of towards the Allies. And then you might hear about something called Vichy France, which was a part of France that was eventually kind of allied with the Axis. All right, so speaking of the Axis, let's talk about our bad guys. This would be Germany, Italy, and Japan. So let's get started here. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of the rise of the Axis. And, to start this, we kind of have to go back a little bit, kind of like when we ended chapter 27, section 4. But World War I ends with an agreement known as the Treaty of Versailles. Technically, it's this agreement that ends World War I. And if you look at the provisions of that treaty, it is a treaty that was basically very punitive. It was a treaty that was meant to punish the Germans for starting World War I. And as a result of this Treaty of Versailles, Germany kind of slips into an economic depression. So even though when the World War I ends, they are supposedly left with the Weimar Republic, which was kind of an attempt at democracy. Democracy wasn't looking so good when you look at it from an economic point of view. Germany also had to give up all their military hardware that would include U-boats, aircraft, things like that. But they also had to give up a lot of territory. And this is what becomes kind of the catalyst for the Second World War. When Adolf Hitler rises to power, he promises the German people something known as Lebensraum, which is something known as living space. And in 1933, he's coming to power, and one of the things that he wants to do is to increase the living space for the German people, which basically means recouping some of this lost territory from the Treaty of Versailles. So, with number one, Germany expanded in the late 1930s when it took over German-speaking Austria and a region of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland, which had a very large German-speaking population. Before we get into the whole Czech Sudetenland controversy here, we kind of have to go back half a step here. This whole idea of trying to gain this living territory was kind of a work in progress. And really in 1935, Adolf Hitler really kind of got the ball rolling. I mentioned before, one of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles is that the Germans had to give up a good portion of their military. And Germany got Great Britain to sign a treaty that would allow them to start constructing submarines, or as the Germans would call them, U-boats, and other warships. Because of the fact that, towards the east of Germany, there lies the Soviet Union. And there was a great concern that communism was going to be spreading throughout the continent of Europe. And we had seen a little bit of this. There had been some communist rumblings in places like Italy, and communist rumblings that had kind of been toying around in places like France, and even in places like Spain and Great Britain. So I think the British kind of thought that might not be a bad idea, not understanding that this was kind of, the start of some kind of bigger plan that Hitler had. So going back and talking about the Sudetenland. Hitler didn't necessarily start off with Austria and Czechoslovakia initially. In 1936, Hitler occupied a territory known as the Rhineland, which was actually a part of Germany prior to the end of World War I. And it kind of borders along the Rhine River. And there have been times when this Rhineland had kind of changed hands, primarily between the Germans and the French. Okay, in 1938, Hitler annexed the country of Austria. That's his homeland. That was actually where he was born, and technically he is a native Austrian. And this became known as Anschluss, which was basically this whole idea of getting the German-speaking people all united. So by the time we get to the end of 1938, we get into this issue about the Sudetenland. And so at number 3, the British and the French did not stand in the way of Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland. And this policy became known as appeasement. Kind of the man who is kind of the poster child of this whole situation was British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who you see pictured below here, even pictured with Adolf Hitler. But he and some of his other cronies in the British Parliament in France, they met with Adolf Hitler, and they thought, if we could get him to agree to just taking the Sudetenland and being done with taking any more land, they could prevent a world war. Okay, and so they got Hitler to sign a piece of paper, which you see in Chamberlain's hands, and supposedly this was going to be peace for our times. Winston Churchill, who was an opponent within the British Parliament of Neville Chamberlain, thought that this was just ridiculous, and that they shouldn't be caving into kind of a pushy man like Adolf Hitler. And what's interesting as time goes on, there are other people that start kind of finding Churchill's message to be very appealing. At the same time, there's other rumblings happening in Europe. An international impact of the Spanish Civil War was a situation where the Italians and the Germans supported a group known as the Nationalists, who were primarily fascist. And the Soviet Union supported a group known as the Republicans. We talked a little bit about this communist rumbling. What ends up happening is we have a victory for the nationalists, and part of that was in part because of the fact that the Italians and the Germans were funneling military hardware to our nationalists, and a guy named Francisco Franco becomes the fascist dictator of Spain. And what's interesting, compared to Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, Francisco Franco is going to stay in power until his death in the 1970s. In August 1939, the Nazis and the Soviets signed what is known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which was an agreement on both sides that they would recognize each other's rights to lands in Eastern Europe. This whole idea is that neither one of these nations, the Germans or the Soviets, would attack one another. But in the process, the lands that kind of lie between Germany and the Soviet Union would be divvied up by the two powers. And as a result of this, we're going to have the beginnings of World War II. World War II officially began on September 1st, 1939. Okay, this happened when the Germans invaded the nation of Poland, followed by a massing of German troops on the western border. Sometimes this gets recognized as something called the Blitzkrieg, this whole idea of lightning warfare and moving troops quickly. The Polish, for the most part, were shocked. They were not prepared for this event. And as I mentioned before, the Germans were moving very swiftly. They came in with their tanks and their aircraft, and they moved fast. Truth is, the Germans pretty much used all their aircraft, or the majority of this, in this invasion. Had the British and the French known this, that might have changed maybe the way that they handled this war. They might have been a little more aggressive here at the beginning. With millions of soldiers, the Soviet Red Army was able to unable to withstand the German Blitzkrieg eventually. We're eventually going to see a situation where the Germans are going to attack the Soviets, but it's not going to happen until 1941. But part of that was the Soviets, when it came to their troops, okay, they were poorly trained and poorly equipped. Okay, so as a result of this whole event of the invasion of Poland, we're going to have the beginnings of World War II. But there is a period of time between when this invasion kind of wraps up in the fall of '39 until we actually see a military confrontation. And this period is kind of nicknamed the Phony War. And it also has another nickname that we're going to mention here in just a little bit. Somewhere in your packet, if you have room, and if you don't, you might want to get a piece of loose leaf, I need you to write down this information. So, during the period of the Phony War, this is a period from the time that Great Britain and France declared war on Germany and until Germany decides to invade the nations of Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg in May of 1940. During this period, there was no large-scale military action on the Western Front, meaning that border between Germany and, let's say, France. Nothing was going on. Though there had been some skirmishes, don't get me wrong, there had been some events that were happening kind of towards the north in the Scandinavia, and there was some things that were obviously happening out onto the high seas. But it was also a time when we started beginning what I would call economic warfare against Germany. We had the forms of naval blockades. This was sometimes punctuated by German U-boats torpedoing ships that were blockading. This also was an opportunity for our allies to try to negotiate peace with Germany. And this, guys like Neville Chamberlain were working very hard, trying to find some kind of resolution. And what's interesting is, it kind of leads to a divided Great Britain. You have those who were obviously wanting Great Britain to stay neutral and to stay out of it, and maybe try to figure out a way that they could, continue to appease Adolf Hitler to spare their lives. And part of that was in response to the mass number of deaths that were experienced during the First World War. And then there was another set of people that were probably more hawkish, okay, people who were wanting to go to war. And a lot of these individuals were under the kind of the leadership of Winston Churchill. Okay, during this time, both sides are going to mobilize. We're going to try to build up the military as quickly as we can. We might prepare our civilians, maybe prepare shelters and things like that. Great Britain this was a time when children were evacuated. There was a large number of children, if their families could afford it, that were sent from the cities to the countrysides, and in some cases, if there were relatives that lived in the Americas, these children were sent to places in Canada or the United States to live with relatives during the course of the war. Sometimes this is given a nickname, and this is kind of one that kind of was thrown around by Winston Churchill. Remember the Blitzkrieg lightning warfare? Well, this period of time of the Phony War was sometimes known as the Sitzkrieg, because we were kind of sitting on our bottoms here and not doing all that much. Number 9, Hitler's attack on Great Britain, by the time we get to the summer of 1940, differed from his attack on France, because after Holland and Belgium for the most part fell, Luxembourg fell, the French for the most part were easily taken by the Germans. So when the Germans attacked France, they used tanks and such, but we got water separating our friends in England, and so we're going to have to use aircraft. And eventually we're going to have, kind of an air battle that we're going to talk about here soon. One event that you may have seen maybe in motion pictures lately is something known as the Miracle at Dunkirk, the rescue of 300,000 Allied troops at Dunkirk. Dunkirk is kind of in the northwestern part of the country of France. This marks the surrender of our nation of France to the Germans. Dunkirk was a miracle because of the fact that we had all these troops. Many of them were evacuated by merchant ships that were coming from England. So you had civilians that were rescuing these soldiers, and it was a very dangerous situation. So after Dunkirk, the Germans prepare to attack the British, and we start seeing this in October of 1940, probably through the beginning of 1941. But the German air attack, the goal here was to kind of soften the British up so that it would be easier if Germany wanted to do an all-out invasion of the United Kingdom. And Hitler really wanted to destroy the British Royal Air Force. And what's interesting is this whole event becomes really Hitler's first major failure. He did not anticipate the technological advances that the British had made. And one of the things that the British had on their side was radar. They could detect aircraft coming in from the continental part of Europe, and so their civilians could be put in bomb shelters. This is an example. This is basically a subway station in London, and you can see all the civilians that are laying there during an air raid. So with this targeted attacks, occasionally cities like London would be attacked. It wasn't that civilians were spared. I mean, the British, for the most part, lost an extreme number of civilians because of these bombing raids. But yet at the same time, it deterred Hitler from ever wanting to do an all-out invasion of the United Kingdom. And eventually he's going to focus his energies towards the east, primarily towards the Soviet Union. So let's talk about some of these causes and effects of World War I or World War II. Again, you may want to write these down, but we did have economic hardship and political unrest after World War I. We had aggressive leaders in Germany, Italy, and even Japan who wanted to expand their nations. And then eventually we have the German invasion of Poland, which really gets the war going. So, Axis advances. By the time we get through 1941, a good portion of continental Europe is under the control of the Axis powers. There are a few areas here that are not. And these are nations that are primarily neutral, like Switzerland, Spain and Portugal, Ireland, Sweden, Turkey. But North Africa, a lot of that is being occupied by the Axis powers, either through the British or through the Italian or the Germans. So, yeah, we got a big war to talk about. Thank you very much.